So this is going to be more of a like broader strokes essay. Um, this is really going to hit on the history of immigration in America, specifically the early 20th century, and just kind of understanding the real wealth, the root of the wealth um, that is early 20th century American professional baseball. We all understand very clearly the lines that were drawn through segregation and exclusion in that period. But I think there is a lot of redemptive history there, specifically in regards to immigrants, uh, immigrants specifically from Europe in the early 20th century, who came to the United States with their families and became miners. So you have the copper mines actually in upper Michigan. You have the mines in the Appalachian. And then you have the man who is depicted here, Jack Quinn, one of the last great spitballers, who actually he ended up playing well into his 50s, um, who also was a miner, right? And we talked about Kovaleski and Daubert and Ed Walsh and Lefty Grove, right? It's it's something that's almost too strange and too common. He immigrated, Jack Quinn, from Hungary, arriving in 1884 as a young child, and they immigrated to Pennsylvania near Buck Mountain. Um, and Quinn actually, again, he spent time in the mines as a breaker boy and then transitioned to a laborer, and then moved from there into his baseball career. Um, the fertility of reckoning with baseball is understanding the eras of America's social, political, economic, and even spiritual existential development as a nation. And the wealth that baseball provides us in terms of understanding the history of humanity and the development of America, specifically through immigration, specifically through the very violent processes of slavery and economic exploitation, um, that created really in the foundations of how this country was built, both in terms of the plantations and the industrial growth through factories and coal mining, industrial production, that created the circumstances that we live in today in terms of the infrastructure of modern America, and by and large the modern world. Right, industrialization was a global movement that ultimately formed the digital interconnection that we now experience. And America was a forerunner of this process. I think you'd be very hard pressed to make an argument that any other nation had the amount of industrial firepower that America quickly scaled. And when you think about what it takes to create industrial firepower, it takes energy. And that energy is coming from the earth, it's coming from these coal mining operations, forging steel from coal. So, this labor power, this machine power, this earth power is coming from two different kind of sectors of the American economy. I'll say three because you have the Chinese laborers who built the railroads. You have the slaves from the transatlantic slave trade in the American South who are building the Southern wealth in an agricultural sense using industrial methods. And then in the Northeast, you have this large population of new immigrants, first, second generation immigrants who are working in the mines and who are working in the factories, living in the tenements in New York City, or they're living in these Pennsylvanian or Appalachian towns uh, doing the mining, right? Or they're living in Michigan doing the copper mining, which is necessary to construct these new age industrial machines. As well as cities like Pittsburgh, again, where they're working in the steel mills, they're working in these steel factories to produce the new metallurgies of modernity. And so when you look at the history of baseball and you look at it at a deeper level and on a deeper plane, you're looking at the richness of humanity. You have everything from carnies to vaudeville actors to this foundational substratum of the miners turned baseball players. So Jack Quinn, you wouldn't. It was hard. It's almost like a Satchel Paige situation with Quinn, because it's very difficult to figure out when he was born and the early details of his life, because he immigrates very early from Slovakia and settles in some general area of Pennsylvania. But again, as we discussed with Paige and Cy Young, this period of time of modern history so much escapes narrativization, right? There's not the kind of surveillance level technology in terms of identity structure of self that existed back then. Jack Quinn kind of exists in this lone, strange, and solitary outpost of being a first generation immigrant to the United States of America with his family, and he becomes a miner, and perceivably or conceivably he's going to be a miner for the rest of his life until he gets into baseball. Even his name was something that was up in the air. His legal documents were signed John Picus, but he said his real name was something different, but he didn't remember exactly what it was. His mother died when he was a few weeks old, and there was a process of remarrying. So you have this phenomenon of lack of knowledge that I think underpins, and we discussed this with the Deadball era episodes, a lot of what's happening in this period of time in American history, precisely because history is not being written in a way that's centering this working class, mining class, immigrant class of humans. And the way that I view American history and baseball history, this is the epicenter of what needs to be discussed, because all of the innovation and energy and real power in terms of the creation of civilization and the American empire is coming directly from them. The history remembers and recognizes the patriarchs and the industrialists like Henry Ford, or the presidents, so to speak, and these are the people that are written into the history books. But when I look at American history and I look at the real impact, and you look at these early modern American towns built around the coal mines or the copper mines, you're looking at some of the most profound history in terms of the architecture, the human experience, the intergenerational lineage of mining, or the cultivation of community, closeness in community through participation in these working class events, these labor events, whether they're town halls or whether they're musical celebrations or cultural celebrations around a church or a certain denomination. You're looking at the real richness and the full body of human history through that lens, particularly. And you see baseball as being the epicenter of a lot of these practices, and baseball is actually one of the ways that these different ethnic groups of first and second generation immigrants who come to these coal mining towns to labor as miners, as a way to come together and participate in a community event. It's a recreational sport or an entertainment sport. And obviously, as these miners come to the United States, they seek out their ethnic enclaves in order to be able to speak the old language as they're trying to assimilate into America and speak English. And there's this whole process which is really profound and extreme and very difficult. Not to mention the labor that they're actually doing in these mines, which is extremely, incredibly difficult. They're gathering in these churches, right, which are, again, they're still ethnically segregated, and there's this sense of ethnic difference. Baseball itself actually becomes the way of community integration. Because again, baseball is not being segregated denominationally. It's a community sport that's happening locally. So the the anthracite region of coal, where that kind of Pennsylvania area, where they are doing this farming of the coal from the depths of the earth, there is so much difficulty in terms of integration, the conflict that's happening between ethnicities, the wages that they're being given, the working conditions. All of it is just this incredible difficulty, and through the this process, baseball emerges, I think, for a lot of these players as a method to create a life in this new world, right? Because as I think we're all aware, the coal mining prospects are not very great. These working class, newly immigrated laborers they're either born in these mines and die in them, or they immigrate and begin working in these mines and die in them. As an ethnic community which is attempting to establish its roots in a new world. This process of immigration changes a lot of things, right? Jack Quinn changes his name from John Picus. But even then, right, what is his original name? His identity is changing. His language is changing. He's being acclimated to a very violent and difficult process and moment in time in American history, which is industrialization through mining power, the labor power in the mines. So he's working same as Kovaleski or Daubert, working as a breaker boy in these coal mines and coal sorting process, right? So he actually ends up working as a laborer after he works as a breaker boy. And this was no issue. I mean, child labor was going to happen. There were no laws that were preventing this from occurring. And so you have these young immigrant children who are trying to figure out what to do. He ends up hopping on a freight train to the west to go to Montana sometime in the 1890s, according to history. And he has nothing. He's got ragged clothes, tattered cap, and his two fists, as he recounts himself. Later returns to Pennsylvania and throws a ball back during a semi-pro game, and then gets hired as a pitcher. And then the rest is history. These lifestyles in the early 1900s were almost mythically constructed out of necessity that formed a creative or even spiritual path for many of these people who became kind of wanderers or vagabonds or even acts in the circus to sustain a lifestyle. This is something, again, that was common in the Negro Leagues, the combination of circus acts and entertainment acts with baseball. A lot of the early barnstorming teams in black baseball had to get incredibly creative because what they really were was like a traveling act, in effect. That's what these teams were. That's what baseball was, and in many ways is what baseball is still to this day. So the craft that Quinn is cultivating, and again, he ends up pitching through into his 50s. Again, much like Satchel Paige, these two figures have a lot in common. He's creating himself from nothingness. His old identity from Slovakia has to be entirely left behind. From Old Hungary has to be entirely left behind. He changes his name. It's not even clear if he himself or there is memory of what his name originally was, even beyond Picus, because Picus was an inherited name from a process of remarrying that his father underwent. It's not even clear, right, what that old identity is. And so we're really getting to the meat of this here. It's that there's a historical erasure through this process of immigration. Many of these people, which were fleeing utterly untenable circumstances, to come to the United States and work in the coal mines. And then history forgets, right? History forgets their names, their identities, their stories, right? So a lot of this is about reclaiming and honoring those stories, the dignity in those stories. And it's difficult, as we talked about in the darkness of history episode, to reclaim that and see that, but the humanity is there and the essence is there, and that's so much of what history is and is about. Um, the loss of his name, the loss of his birth, the loss of a sense of rooted place or continuity of culture, continuity of inheritance, right? Even his mother dies when he's very young. Um, the loss of all of this and the uprootedness. He gets on a freight train in the 1890s and heads all the way up to Montana with nothing. Um, this is a man who's been so thoroughly uprooted from history and thrown into the machine of modernity as a nothing and as a zero. He's a zero factor in this equation of modernity as an immigrant who's thrust into this new American culture, which is really not a culture, it's a machine of economy. And in that process, baseball actually becomes this lifeline or this way or this path for him to build a life, a self, a practice, a form of stability and a ground and a foundation in a world where otherwise, ethnically, socially, culturally, he doesn't exist. The world in which he was born into and the world in which he is now living are in such a state of massive flux that his ethnic and cultural identity would be this kind of small immigrant church of Hungarians in a Pennsylvanian coal mining town, and he would be living and working as a coal miner. But through this cultural integrative practice of baseball, which brings together all these different ethnicities in the town, as well as in the nation at large, again, right, America being an immigrant nation, whether that's from slavery, from labor, from indentured servitude, from people who are seeking asylum, right? That's just the history of America. When you look at that, and baseball as a unifying force beneath that, it's almost what allows someone like Jack Quinn to exist. Because in all other senses and words, he doesn't exist. He's nameless. He's faceless. He's statusless. He's cultureless. He's uprooted. And so you have this kind of new modern nomad, which is this mass influx of integration and immigration in America in the early 1900s, with these European immigrants from places where they're not even speaking the same language, right? And so there's this process that unfolds through which baseball becomes a way of cultural matriculation and a way of establishing a communal identity and rooting oneself in the new American world. And I talked to you about my friend Victor and my friend Cesar that I spoke about. And both of them had very similar things to say about baseball being a way of grounding immigration from Cuba in the early and mid and late 1900s as a way of understanding and saying, this is something that translates to me. The athleticism, or even just because the sport of baseball was so popular in Cuba, the sport of baseball is something it's a cultural memory that translates across these borders where not very little else remains the same in terms of the dislocation of immigration. So this really comes down to a sort of desperation of economy, which is extremely common to this early 1900s baseball scene, both in terms of black barnstorming, the Negro Leagues, and the European immigrants who come to America and work as coal miners and work as factory workers in these northeastern towns, kind of Appalachian area towns, as well as cities like New York or Pittsburgh or Detroit. You're seeing an ecosystem that's forming out of economic necessity, a labor necessity that's occurring in this rapid scaling industrialization of America as a civilization and an empire. And you're seeing this flooding in of immigrant labor, through which there is this process where those identities get intertwined with the development of baseball as a mass cultural phenomenon. And so then you have this great portion of American history and baseball history, which is so incredibly profound, that tells the tale of modern American history through immigration and through acculturation, through baseball as being one of the primary, if not the biggest ways that immigrants found their footing in modern America, and thus is such a big part of the popularity of baseball heading into the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and even onward. Um, because you see, right, players like Jack Quinn, there's a level of profound resonance in terms of understanding their popularity, right? Where they're coming from, who they are, who they represent. It's seeing one of your own on that cultural stage in terms of just representation. There's a Jack Quinn, as a Hungarian first generation immigrant who was working in the Pennsylvania mines, is standing on the mound in the World Series. Um, and there's a resonance there, right? We discussed that a little bit with Lefty Grove, but there's a resonance there in terms of this emerging immigrant culture where there are so many like Jack Quinn. They lose their names, they lose their birthdays, they lose their identities, they lose their cultural sense of self and uprooting through this process of immigration, through sheer necessity, to work in the factories and the mines. Um, and you become a nameless, faceless laborer. There are no labor laws that are protecting you or your children. There are no uh, there's no real care by the companies that are employing these people, right? If they die, they're replaced, or the labor laws are very, very, very bad. And so you see a movement in terms of Eugene Debs and later with FDR in terms of reprioritizing and recentering and rebalancing the American culture and civilization at large to prioritize, respect, and dignify the American laboring body. Um, but baseball does this innately and intuitively by people like Jack Quinn becoming cultural and even political forces by way of their very participation in baseball history, because they create a recentering of the American myth towards these people who otherwise are utterly erased, right? In terms of history being written by and for this sort of grand narrative of conquering and power and politics and economy. Um, Baseball is a subversive cultural layer and cultural history, not only just in terms of America, but globally, um, through its radical recentering and reprioritization of people, individuals who come from all of these different, very diverse backgrounds, and many of whom come from very poor working class backgrounds, such as Jack Quinn, first generation immigrant working in the coal mines. Um, and when these histories are remembered, much of the history I just gave you was through the Saber biography of Jack Quinn. When these histories are remembered and cataloged and archived and institutionalized, what they do is they redeem from the depths of history what is lost. Remembering Jack Quinn is not remembering everything and everyone, but it's remembering an entire group of people, right? It's remembering an entire aspect of American history, which was hidden and buried and left to the rubble of the past due to a perceived carelessness, which was carried on into the future, which is to say these people's humanity was the work that they did and the labor that they did, which is just patently not true. And that's not humanity. It's a dehumanization and a mechanization of the human being, and the human impulse. And what baseball does is it creates a window into that humanity through cultural participation, not only just in terms of who's on the mound, such as Jack Quinn, but the people who are in the stands, who are a reflection of Jack Quinn, and Jack Quinn is reflecting them back to themselves in his very nature and self and essence. This is the possibility of a much larger historical redemption through baseball and baseball history as an institutionalization, a process of institutionalizing memory, than really has ever been possible before historically. Due to the fact that baseball acts as a springboard to access these past histories, which otherwise would be, they would live and die ancestrally in these small towns, and very few, if any, people would leave intergenerationally. A lot of these mining families are intergenerational, and they continue to be so. The fathers and grandfathers and great grandfathers are miners, and they live and work and die and pass that ancestral lineage down in these small towns. Um, we're talking about really recovering things that are otherwise esoteric and hidden in the American lineage and process of history, um, particularly in such a story as Jack Quinn's, because you understand the conditions of mining, especially for these breaker boys and these child laborers in these mines. You understand, as a first generation immigrant who can't even remember his last name, the birthday is up in the air, right? There's so many different things that are lost. So his sense of identity and his center of identity is lost. He has to create himself from the rubble of history, which is a series of movements which decreates him, and kind of strips him down to the bone. And he has to find a way to realize himself in this process. And a lot of that for him comes through baseball. He does not leave the sport. He creates himself and constructs himself through the act of baseball. You see the action that he takes, taking a freight train all the way up to Montana in the middle of the 1890s. This is a man who has been decentered, and it is rootless, and is in this profound state of existential exile. This is a story that, when it's told, is a story that's being told for thousands and thousands, tens and even hundreds of thousands of people, in terms of an immigrant body, an immigrant class of population that is so much of the early 1900s in America, who become this labor for the industrial machine as miners and as factory workers. And then it being preserved, his story being preserved through baseball and nationalized through baseball, is a reification and a deification of that history. And when I say deification, I mean a prioritization, in that Jack Quinn and his story is meaningful. And as such, it preserves the fabric of the larger historical, social, and cultural unfolding of this time. And in that preservation, allows us to remember. So Jack Quinn, in this way, is an archetypal representative of this entire process that's occurring of mass immigration into these mines and into these factories in the Northeast and the Midwest, and the difficulty of that process of assimilation and how it functioned in these small towns, the ethnic churches, the extreme class warfare on behalf of these factory and mine owners who were extracting every single last drop that they could out of these laborers, and the process really of identity construction and reconstruction from the ash and rubble of this desperate process of immigration to try to create a better life in this new world. It's a profound human process and a profound human moment and movement. And it's the real center and force of early American modernity. But again, is not recognized due to a linear creation or a linear historiography which prioritizes power and economy, in sacrifices really, and dehumanizes and dematerializes the real spiritual human experience of undergoing this massive process and this massive turn of modernity, which is globalization, as we discussed, through technology, through information, through transportation, and really first and foremost through immigration, because there's a huge ethnic intertwining into the American bones in this early industrial modern period, with people like Jack Quinn, who really are building themselves in this process of self-creation. With him, I think, is very, very profound. He's creating himself not only as a human being, but as a pitcher. And there's this series of events which are almost synchronistic, which throw him into this lifestyle and this way of being, which is thankfully, right, again, preserved by baseball historiography at large as a cultural heritage site, which is sort of metaphysical or immaterial, which has record, right, newspaper, photography, baseball cards, all of these different ways in which we have discussed that record. Which then which really just allows for, in terms of those interviews, the conversations, the talks that are published as part of baseball history, quote unquote, it's really just a way for and a way into American history in a way that otherwise we would have very hard time accessing in terms of those ancestral records. And you can see and hear and feel through his interviews who he was as a person. Um, Quinn himself attributed his surprising longevity to peace of mind. Nothing bothers me, he told a reporter. Why should it? The Undertaker will take us all soon enough. There's no need to meet him more than halfway. A lot of pitchers worry themselves out of the game. They cut their span of successful work by whole seasons. What a foolish thing to do. Um, as much as I want to win, I'm not crazy about it. I realize the other fellow wants to win too. If I'm lucky enough to get the breaks, well and good. If he outlucks me, I may get my turn next time. Doing his best is no more than a pitcher is paid for. Bearing down in the pinches is what he's supposed to do. But that isn't worry and it isn't physical strain. I don't lie awake in the morning wondering what might have happened if I pitched a little inside instead of outside to a certain batter. Overdoing a thing is half doing it. There's only one right way to pitch a ball game. Do your best and let it go at that. Fussing and stewing and fretting is like throwing grit into the machinery. You hear the ethos and the soul of who he is and who he was and how he constructed himself existentially as a person through baseball. Again, the similarities between Quinn and Satchel Paige or even someone like Cy Young are profound because they impart bits of wisdom. Satchel Paige says, don't eat fried food. Cy Young says, a pitcher like a poet is born, not made. Right, the little quotations, which are philosophical. Satchel Paige, don't look back, something might be gaining on you. They prioritize rest. They prioritize a sense of easy perseverance, right? These people who sculpt themselves, I think specifically even through the act of pitching as a craft, you can see the self emerging through that way of self-expression and that way of being. That Jack Quinn loses his name, his birthday, his culture, the ground of his nation, where his family is from. He loses everything, and he's thrown into the coal mines and rides on a freight train halfway across America up into Montana, and then returns to Pennsylvania, and just by throwing a ball back to a semi-pro team, becomes one of the longest lasting pitchers in the game of baseball. And a very, very good pitcher too, as well. It's the construction of self is so powerful, especially when it comes from figures like Quinn or Satchel Paige, and I think especially Quinn here because everything is lost. His identity, his name, his culture, everything. He's thrown into the mines, and maybe the one thing that remains is the ethnic enclave based around the church of Hungarians in this small town Pennsylvanian environment, which is all based around the economy of coal and coal mining, anthracite coal. He, in this process, from the utter depths of total loss of identity, total self-exile, total ancestral exile, everything that he is from, all of his blood, all of his lineage is gone. And from that, he actually creates himself philosophically into like a philosopher, into an existential philosopher whose sense of self and way of life is perceived through the energetic movement of creation through the art of pitching, which is so much like what Satchel Paige does. And when you look at Satchel Paige and you look at the history of black baseball, we're talking about something very similar in terms of the utter uprooting, cultural, social, political uprooting of the self, the loss of identity, which is stripped in the profoundly violent act of slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, and being brought to the United States and enslaved to do work on these plantations. Everything is lost, right? Even the concept of the master's name is at work here. And so you're talking about an ancestral lineage through which the dynamic is the loss of everything. It's the loss of self, the loss of identity, the loss of roots and culture. And baseball provides a venue to step into in a deeply spiritual, even human historical, world historical, global sense to create the self through the practice and the sculpting of the art of pitching. Satchel Paige names all of his pitches different ways. Jack Quinn adopts the spitball, and he has a certain way that he throws it. This is an art of the creation of self. It's just a baseball is it appears to be the surface, but what these people are doing is they're actually radically constructing the self and expressing the self, and through that construction and expression over time as a practice, forming a radical personal self-philosophy and identifying with life at the ground level, at the energetic root level, of the expression of the physical body and the expression of the spirit of the individual through the physical body. The loss of all of this culture and the civilization and the self, the identity, the name, all of the former historical and cultural roots that would ground you in a certain tradition and a way of being have been stripped in this modern existential right of slavery and labor, and being thrown into that tumult and that chaos and that loss. What happens is through baseball, there's a resurrection of the self, a resurrection of identity at a deeper level, maybe than ever before, because it's direct, it's explicitly, intimately individual, and it's the relationship between the ball and the pitcher, the mound and the pitcher, the art and the act of pitching, which is so solitary, so sculptural, so self integrated through the very movement of the art of pitching itself, that you create yourself from the absolute substratum of existence in that intimate relationship and art of the physical act, the gesture, the movement. This is so much like what painting is, or any other art form like music, but again, it's so much more physically, athletically embodied. Each pitcher is different. They throw the ball differently. They have a different approach, a different philosophy, a different way of creating perspective on the batter or the game. And so that's a way in. It's a way into self in a way that we don't really have words for culturally or socially because it's so intimately, directly personal. So Jack Quinn's identity, it's not even his, it's his art, it's his act of pitching. And so when you see Jack Quinn or Satchel Paige pitching into their late 50s and 60s, you see someone who has sculpted and created themselves through the game, through the art and the act of pitching, and that itself becomes the identity. That itself becomes the way of being. And so you live with that, you participate with that, and you work with that, and you become better over time. One of Quinn's best seasons happened, I believe, when he was 45 years old. He just continues to still himself and ground himself and still himself in this root of being, in this practice. And you see a deeper sense of self of a man emerge who's so deeply intertwined with this existential practice and process of baseball. He's so grounded in the root swell of that movement, and his soul becomes so rich through that process because he's intertwined himself with this process of creation. He's intertwined himself with this practice in which he's developed his own identity, his own method, his own philosophy, and thus becomes a true, deep individuated self, truly individuated self. From the depths of this alienation, this exile, this isolation, this chaos of loss, the loss of cultural ground, the loss of ancestral meaning, the loss of history, and he gains himself in this nothingness, in this abyss of history, in this existential crisis. It's so powerful. This is such a dynamic unfolding. It's so meaningful. So that's what you really see here when you look at this man and you see what's possible. The profundity of this movement, the existential power and the spirit and the soul of what can be created in this venue of baseball and what was created in this venue of baseball. You see the richness of the soul, the possibility of the human being beyond all previous concepts in direct relationship with the athletic movement, with the process of self-cultivation, with the strategy, with the attempt to discern direction, to day by day, game by game, pitch by pitch, strategize and revolutionize and reprioritize. Through that process of the game, Jack Quinn creates himself where otherwise all creation was abandoned and lost to time and history. He becomes free, he becomes individual through the ashes and the loss of everything. It's incredibly profound. That's what I've got. I'll catch you on the next one.